Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today for another presentation in the GreyLearning Webinar Series sponsored by Tamron. I want to start off by thanking Tamron for making this series of presentations possible. Today, we're going to be talking about good organizational habits for the photographer, a topic that is near and dear to my heart, something that I work on, spend a lot of time thinking about, spend a lot of time helping photographers with. And so I'm going to just share some of my ideas, some of the things that I think are important when it comes to essentially a workflow that makes sense for you as a photographer. So let's get started. I am Tim Grey. I'll be presenting today this webinar. Yes, one of the questions I always get, will it be recorded? It will indeed. And if you're registered, and since you're here joining me live, obviously you are registered, you'll get a link in an email after the presentation so that you can go watch it again or catch any parts that you may have missed along the way. I'm Tim Grey from GreyLearning. Many of you are already familiar with the GreyLearning video training courses that we've been publishing. I hope you're enjoying those and finding them tremendously helpful, especially in the context for today's presentation as it relates to workflow. One of the points that I want to make first and foremost is that there isn't a single right answer for every photographer. And what I mean by that is, essentially your workflow might be different from mine. And so today I'm going to share some of the things that I do, some of the decisions that I've made in my own workflow. And I'll, give you the reasons why I've made certain decisions. But again, the key to keep in mind is that the solution that works well for me is not necessarily the solution that works best for you. And so you might need to sort of filter things, you might say. You might need to interpret some of what I'm talking about. And I'm going to try and focus primarily on concepts so that you can translate that to your own workflow and give you some food for thought, essentially. And this image is one that always comes to mind whenever I think about any concept of people having different opinions. This actually is one of the photos. I used to share this photo a lot. It was one of my favorites, and I would often present it as a favorite, and people would look cross-eyed at it, wondering why someone would consider this a favorite photo. And I explained that Santa Monica is where I was born, so this was a special place. This is the sign at the Santa Monica Pier, a place that I enjoyed as a child. And so, there's this element of images being special for different reasons, and workflows will be special for different reasons, and you'll need to define your own workflow based on what works for you. I think when it comes to your workflow, when it comes to organizing your photos, you're naturally going to be using some degree of software. I happen to use Lightroom Classic, I should say, and in terms of managing my overall workflow, managing my photos, keeping track of my photos. And so some of what I'll talk about today does relate to Lightroom on some level, but really it's more a matter of understanding workflow decision making. And so first and foremost, you've got to understand your software. And ideally, understand your software before you actually start using that software. Now, in some cases, the software doesn't create any inherent challenges. So, for example, many of you, I imagine, are using Adobe Bridge to manage your photos. And that's a pretty straightforward approach because Adobe Bridge is a browser. With Adobe Bridge, you don't have a catalog. I'll talk more about catalogs in a moment. You just have software that you point to a folder and say, show me the images in this folder. Now, Bridge does create a cache. It essentially helps itself in terms of improving performance so that if you go back to a folder that you visited recently, it doesn't have to rebuild all of the information, all of the preview images, for example, for the photos in that folder. It maintains a cache of the photos, for example, that you've browsed recently. But it doesn't maintain a catalog in the background, and that makes it a little bit more streamlined, you might say, in terms of workflow. There's some disadvantages, but overall, it streamlines your workflow in terms of just not having to do some of these other tasks, managing a catalog, for example. And that also means that it's not as complicated, there's not as much risk. So if you don't understand Adobe Bridge when you first start using it, there's not as great a risk as, for example, not understanding Lightroom, which does use a catalog. And so understanding your software, varying degrees depending on, you might say, the complexity of your software, but very important that you do understand. And ideally, taking that a step further, having a sense of your workflow. And that's what we'll be talking about a lot for the rest of today's presentation is, what sorts of things do you do in your workflow to help make sure that your photos are organized, essentially. And part of that relates to the software. And so to the extent possible, make sure that you really know how to use your software before you start using it, ideally, and make sure that you understand what your workflow is going to be as well. On a related note, I can tell you that one of our most popular courses, actually I think the most popular course in all of GreyLearning, is cleaning up your mess in Lightroom. This course has been very popular, and of course, in large part because photographers have made a little bit of a mess of their Lightroom catalog, and that relates to not understanding. Many photographers started using Lightroom before they really understood how it worked, and before they really understood, for example, the implications of the catalog that Lightroom uses, and so, as a result, made a mess of the catalog because they weren't aware of the limitations that that catalog approach creates. So, for example, needing to make sure that you do everything inside of Lightroom, that you don't go out to your operating system to rename a folder, for example. But again, that all just comes back to making sure that you actually understand your software and how it works. On a similar note, and I should add, by the way, if you've got questions along the way, there's the Q&A down below, so you can post a question. I see a hello from Washington State. Hello. And so if you've got a question about workflow, by all means, go ahead and post that into the Q&A that you should see at the bottom of your screen. So software independence. I wrote an article a while back in Pixology magazine about catalog independence in particular. And so this is a topic that by and large relates not to browsers such as Adobe Bridge, but rather to software that uses a catalog. So Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, or Lightroom CC, as well as the Elements Organizer, just to name a few examples. And so the software that you're using, if it's employing a catalog, then it is very likely that you're going to have some degree of information that exists in the catalog, and you want to maintain a degree of independence. Essentially what this means is I want to make sure that if the software I'm using should ever be discontinued, that I will be able to work around that, you might say. Some users who are perhaps familiar or maybe still using or were using the Aperture software from Apple can, I'm sure, appreciate this notion of software independence. The Aperture was a bit of a unique scenario in that Aperture, you might say, locked up your photos. It sort of hid everything from you. And so it was a little bit challenging to extract the images, the metadata about your images, etc. There were some challenges in terms of migrating to another platform. And so Aperture users can appreciate that, potential pain point. And I think, Lightroom users want to think about this as well. If down the road you decide Lightroom's not the right solution for you, or if for some reason Adobe ever discontinued the software, what are you going to do? So what does it mean actually to maintain software independence? I mean, I suppose in theory it means just don't use Lightroom at all, or don't use any software at all, don't organize your photos at all. What this really means, though, is to try to make sure that if the software that you're using is no longer available or no longer meets your needs for any reason, that you can migrate to something else. And, this could even relate to hardware. So I'm talking about this in the context of working with software, but hardware could be the same thing. So if you were using floppy disks to store all of your photos from back in the day, then at some point you had a computer. You no longer had a computer that actually featured a floppy drive. I don't have a floppy disk drive anywhere in my possession, not even in my archive and storage. And so, that would be a scenario where, it's similar. You need to maintain your storage over time. And it's similar in terms of software in that you want to make sure you can migrate to other software. So in the context of software like Lightroom, what that means is trying to make sure that you can migrate. So I'll talk about a setting that I like to use in the context of Lightroom, saving metadata out to my image files. but also avoiding features that might be only available in that software. One example would be pick flags versus reject flags inside of Lightroom. Those are a Lightroom-specific feature, you might say. And so, for example, if you assign pick or reject flags in Lightroom, even if you save the metadata out to the photos themselves, you can't see that metadata. You cannot see pick flags and reject flags in Adobe Bridge. And so, keeping in mind in terms of workflow decisions, which features might be specific to that software, which metadata is saved out to the files versus not saved out to the files, and taking that into account in terms of defining your overall workflow. One of the sort of recurring themes is simplicity, is streamlining your overall organizational structure. And so if you're using software such as Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom CC, the Photoshop Elements Organizer, software that uses a catalog, I strongly recommend that you use a single catalog unless you have a very, very good reason to have multiple catalogs. And if you think you have a very good reason to have multiple catalogs, I would spend a little bit of extra time thinking, do you really need those multiple catalogs? When I go to search for a photo to locate a particular image that I want to use, then I don't want to have to stop and think, oh wait, which catalog is that in? I just want to launch Lightroom and go find my photos. And so when it comes to your overall organization, streamlined to the extent possible. And for some photographers, there may be a need. Maybe you have photos that you work with a colleague, you have a partner in a photography business, and you need to maintain a catalog for that business and a separate catalog for your own photos. There are certainly situations where you might need multiple catalogs, but the idea is to try to streamline, to try to simplify as much as possible, to make sure that all of your photos, as much as possible, are kind of in one place and being managed in one way. And so in terms of, I see David has a question here, I only use one catalog in Lightroom. And the answer is yes, indeed. In fact, this is a screenshot that you're seeing here of the catalog section of the left panel in my Lightroom catalog with just over 369,000 images. I won't show you how many of them actually earned a 5-star rating, but we have almost 400,000 photos in my catalog. And so if I'm looking for a photo, I only have to go to one place. Now, there's a lot of photos to go through. There's other organizational steps that I will take to help make sure I could find individual photos. But the point is, I don't have to stop and think about which catalog to open. And on a similar note, the overall storage. So even if you're not using software that uses a catalog, so for example, if you're using Adobe Bridge just to browse and locate photos based on folder structure, based on keywords or what have you, ideally streamlining your storage as well. So having all of your photos, to the extent possible, stored in essentially one place. I don't mean one folder. Put all of your photos, hundreds of thousands of photos in a single folder. We'll talk about folders in just a moment. But rather to have them ideally on a single hard drive, for example. If you use an external hard drive, if at all possible, use a single external hard drive to store all of your images. Or if you're using a Drobo, for example, one of these devices, a network-attached storage device, then we would have possibly multiple hard drives in that device, but to the operating system, it looks like a single hard drive. And so ideally having everything in one place. I realize I run into this limitation myself because I travel so much. I prefer to use bus-powered external hard drives. I use rugged drives, and I often want to take those drives with me because I want to have my photos with me. Well, the maximum size I've been able to get my hands on, well, actually there's a 5 terabyte now, but mine are 4 terabytes, and that's not enough for all of those photos, all of those nearly 400,000 photos. And so I need to have photos archived, some of my photos onto a separate drive until I can get my hands on a rugged drive that's, around about 8 terabytes. I hope that will be available sometime soon. But again, the idea is just to be as streamlined as possible. It makes it simpler in terms of being able to back up your photos, etc. So I want to address a couple of questions that are popping up here related to catalogs, this whole notion of streamlining your storage in general, both in terms of the catalog and photos. So let's see here. We've got 2 people using the same computer. Is it reasonable to use separate catalogs? Yes, of course. That'd be a great example of when it might make sense to have 2 catalogs. If it's 2 photographers in a business, or if a husband and wife, both of you shoot, and you want to keep those photos separated, and there's no reason to have them commingled, and there's advantages to having them separated, then by all means, using multiple catalogs. So yeah, this would relate to, generally speaking, one person. Really good point. John here asks, I use Lightroom, 2 Lightroom catalogs, one for my commercial work and the other for my personal images. Why is this not advisable? It might be perfectly fine if you can draw a good distinction between your commercial work and your personal work. And so, for example, if you were a wedding and portrait photographer, but then you also take pictures on your vacations, then it might make sense that you would use a catalog for your client work and a separate catalog for, kind of everything else. So again, it's not to suggest that there is no scenario where I would ever give any photographer permission to use multiple catalogs. Not that it's up to me, but, when possible, trying to streamline. And so, but one of the things I would add, though, when it comes to kind of commercial versus personal work, if you go out on vacation and, it's purely a personal trip and you take some pictures, but then suddenly you decide that you would like to sell that one of your personal shots, you got a great shot on a beach in the Caribbean, and you want to sell that, you want to license it for stock licensing purposes, for example. Well, that personal image suddenly becomes a commercial shot. So it depends. For me, the lines would be very blurry between, a trip that is intended as a vacation, except I'm still bringing my camera and I might try to sell the photos, versus someone who has a little bit more of a clear distinction. So Barnaby asks how easy it is to merge catalogs. So if you do end up using multiple catalogs, or if you had been using multiple catalogs and then you decide later that you want to make sure that, you want to merge everything into a single catalog. How difficult is it? It's actually very simple, as long as you have access to both catalogs and access to all of the photos, and that none of those photos are missing. So in other words, if you've got a good, clean catalog otherwise, merging them is extremely easy. Essentially, you're just importing from one catalog into another catalog, and the destination, as it were, the catalog you're importing into, then becomes your new master catalog, your only catalog potentially at that point. I do have an article from Pixology that covered that, and it's also covered that Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course that I mentioned earlier in today's presentation. There's also coverage of how do you merge catalogs, how do you clean up a lot of messy issues within Lightroom. And then let's see here. Bob asks, how do I organize scanned family slides and negatives from multiple decades and locations with, let's see, well, I just lost my question. Here we go. And locations without date information available. That would be a tricky one, actually. I'm going to talk about folders in just a second, so let me hold on to that question. And there's a few other questions here, and I'll try to get to as many of these as possible. But let's go ahead and move forward and talk about folders. So I talked about trying to have everything, all of your photos, ideally on a single computer, on a single hard drive, I should say, because it might not be an internal hard drive. And I mentioned, of course, you're not going to just dump everything into a single folder. We want to have some degree of a thoughtful folder strategy. And what does that look like? I don't know. What does it look like? It depends on the photographer. So very often I will hear from photographers who tell me that they organize by date, that their folders start, the year, the number of the month, and maybe even the number of the day. And to me, that's just not possible. It's not possible. I don't know what day of the week it is half the time. I certainly don't know what year I captured a particular image necessarily. And I find that some photographers absolutely can do this. I've quizzed them over the years, and they do indeed remember a lot of those date details. I don't know how they do it, but they do. Often they're engineers of some sort, by the way. I don't know if there's a true a relationship there, but there certainly seems to be a correlation in my experience. In any event, having some degree of a folder strategy that works for you. And the way I generally describe this is to use a folder structure based on the way that you think about your images. For me personally, you can see a little snapshot here of some of my folders, some of my many folders that I use to group together, you might say, my images, to help organize my images. And by and large, you'll notice that this relates to location. In fact, I think what we're looking at right here, it's all location-based, and yet that's not always the case for me. One was cross-country road trip. I guess that is still sort of location because cross-country, driving across the country would be sort of the location. But I tend to, excuse me, I tend to think about my photos in terms of where they were captured. And that is often because I travel extensively. I feel like I'm hardly ever home. And so I travel quite a bit. And so a lot of my photography relates to travel. And so when I'm thinking about my images, I'm often thinking about where I was. It's not necessarily the subject in particular, but again, it varies based on photographer, how they actually approach their images. As I mentioned, there are some photographers out there who impress me to no end, who are able to remember photos essentially based on date. They're able to say, oh yes, and maybe it's partly related to location. You know, they remember that they went to Hawaii in 2012, so they can go to the 2012 folder. For me, that doesn't work. But instead, having a folder structure for me based on location does work by and large. It's not perfect. Every now and then I can't remember what location an image I'm looking for was captured in. Every now and then if you use a date-based folder, you might not be able to find by date. But as long as you can generally find your images, then it's probably a good thing. I will hasten to add, for those photographers who prefer to organize their folder structure by date, bear in mind that you can also filter or search by date. So in Lightroom, for example, I can filter photos based on the date they were captured, so I don't necessarily need a folder structure that matches. That said, part of the reason that I think your folder structure is so important is that later, remember that notion of software independence, if you're not able to use whichever software you are currently using, if at some point you can't use Lightroom becomes unavailable at some point in the future, you could still go back to your overall folder structure. And so, some photographers actually think of this not just for themselves, but for others that might need to access their photos. If they're going to leave their photos with someone else, if somebody else needs to work with their photos, date might make more sense in terms of that folder structure. So in any event, point being, give some thought to what sort of folder structure makes sense. Notice, by the way, that I have dates included in my folders. If I go to the same location multiple times, I will include the year and in some cases the month as part of that folder name. It's just not the beginning of the folder name. Remember, the folders typically are going to be sorted alphabetically, and so if you're scanning through looking for a particular folder, what are you looking for? To me, it's usually location, so I'm going to be going down alphabetically and looking for a folder with a particular location name. But bear in mind that, the date can certainly be included in the file name, or the location if you generally remember based on the date, but you could use the location to help supplement that a little bit by all means. The question is essentially what's going to come first in that folder name. And of course, part of that relates to downloading your photos. And so one of the things that I recommend, part of this just comes from my own paranoia, but to download promptly. And this is for two reasons. First off, downloading by its nature is backing up your photos. You're copying them from a media card, for example, to your hard drive that you use for storing your photos. And so by virtue of downloading from your card to your hard drive, you've just made a copy. And hopefully during that download process, you're also making an additional backup copy, or shortly after the download process, you're making an additional copy so that you have backed up your photos, hopefully in at least a couple of places. And so downloading quickly gives you a backup. It also means that you're getting your photos into your organizational workflow as quickly as possible, as early as possible in that overall process. Taking the pictures is part of your workflow, and I want to move on to that next step of getting the photos organized as quickly as possible. And I also want to be consistent as possible. So for example, using a similar approach to naming my folders, when it comes to the folder structure for storing my photos, I'm going to download into that folder structure. I want to be consistent about that. I don't want to start with the date in some cases and start with a location in other cases in terms of the folder name. Be consistent about that overall approach. And also streamline your download. Now, downloading is one of the issues that I think many photographers have struggled with in the context of Lightroom. And in fact, I think that's part of the reason that Adobe launched the new Lightroom CC as opposed to just continuing to make changes to Lightroom Classic. If you've looked at both Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC, you'll realize that the overall import process is dramatically different. In Lightroom CC, you basically don't do anything. You have no control, very little control. You can't decide on a folder because Lightroom CC manages folders. It happens to use a date-based structure in the background. You can't rename your photos during it. You can't do much of anything during import except just say, add the photos to my catalog. And so it will vary a little bit in terms of, what software you're using, but to the extent possible. I hear from a lot of photographers that recognize the fact that Lightroom is a little bit slow when it comes to downloading your images, importing them into the catalog. And so they'll use other software to download the images, and then they'll import separately once they've already copied the photos to wherever they want to store them. And that's all well and good, but to me, then you're not streamlining that overall process. And so if you're downloading, try to build as much into that process as you possibly can. If you rename your photos, I would generally want to rename during the download process. If you're going to add copyright information to metadata, if you're going to add some basic keywords that relate to all of the photos you're downloading, then I would try to get all of that done right from the start. So, as I mentioned, I use Lightroom Classic, and so when I'm downloading, I'm really importing. So I download as part of my import process. I might rename as part of that process and add some keywords and update the metadata, etc. Point being, I'm trying to do as much work as I can in that one process so that I'm streamlining my overall workflow. Now, there's been a couple of questions here. I'll try to get to some more of the questions here shortly, but about metadata issues in general. And one of the things that is, I think, so important is to preserve your metadata. And I'll talk about metadata a little bit more in terms of the value for actually updating or adding metadata to your images so you can actually find them later. But I want to preserve that. That information is in some respects almost as important as the photos themselves. And the photos are most important, but I want to preserve that metadata as well. And so, for example, I want to make sure that the metadata is written out to the actual image files. In some cases, that's just automatic. If you're using Adobe Bridge, for example, you can just save all of your metadata right into the images. So as you add keywords, they go into the images, for example. In the context of Lightroom, by default, Lightroom does not save the metadata to your actual images. It only saves metadata, meaning any metadata you've updated only gets saved in the catalog. So you add keywords, that metadata goes into your catalog, but not into the photos. Whereas if you go into the catalog settings, go to the metadata tab, you'll find that automatically write changes into XMP checkbox, and you can turn that on, and Lightroom will now save existing metadata updates. So it'll actually go back and perform this task for all of your existing images, and then moving forward, as you apply changes, it will update. There is the argument that this is slowing down Lightroom, that this is causing a performance issue, and there's certainly a degree of truth to that, but I'll take a performance hit in favor of backing up my metadata anytime. And keep in mind, though, that this is limited to what I refer to as standard metadata. So I mentioned already, pick flags versus reject flags are not part of a metadata standard. You might call it a Lightroom only feature. There's other software that makes use of the same concept, but for our purposes, think of that as a Lightroom only feature, which means that when you save metadata, even with this checkbox turned on, Lightroom is not going to save that information, the pick or the reject flag, out to the actual image file. This only relates to standard metadata. So things like star ratings, keywords, and title, caption, other standard metadata values. Interestingly, the develop module adjustment settings or the camera raw settings, those do get saved out to the file as well. Note, by the way, that for proprietary raw captures, the information goes into an XMP sidecar file, an extra file sitting next to the original capture. For other file types, Adobe DNG or JPEG images, for example, that information would actually be written into the files themselves. So depending on your software, your specific needs here may vary, but saving that metadata, preserving that metadata by taking advantage of the option, when applicable, to write that information out to the actual image files. It serves as a bit of a backup. It also makes it easier if you're using other software just to browse. You need to be careful with that approach, of course. But if you, for example, just need to quickly browse some photos in a folder using Adobe Bridge, then you can actually see the metadata, whereas otherwise with the metadata only in your Lightroom catalog, for example, you would not have access to that metadata using other software. So that is a form of backup, you might say. You're backing up your metadata. It's important in general to get serious about backing up, making sure that you're backing up consistently. I'm a little bit silly, I guess, about backing up. I have no problem with that. I think that's a great thing. And what I mean by that is that I'm backing up, I feel like, constantly. If I'm working on a project, then I very quickly, after doing any amount of work on that project, I back up the hard drive. I happen to use a Macintosh. I make use of Time Machine to back up my laptop, for example, to back up the internal hard drive on my laptop. And so anytime I've been working on any files locally, any serious work at all, I do a Time Machine backup. And so making sure that you're keeping your data, your photos plus your metadata. So that would include, for example, backing up your Lightroom catalog, making sure that you have a copy of your catalog copied to a hard drive other than you would that you're using for your actual catalog. So for example, if your catalog is on an internal hard drive, back up that catalog to an external hard drive. And the whole point of backup is to have a copy of your photos and other data on a different storage device, ideally in a different location. So I typically, for most of my backup work, I already mentioned Time Machine. And so in terms of the internal hard drive, I'm backing up via Time Machine in large part. Most of my data, though, is stored on external hard drives, and so I synchronize my external hard drives. I'm using a piece of software called GoodSync. It works very well for my needs. There's an article in Pixology magazine about that. I believe we've covered it elsewhere. Actually, we have a video course in GreyLearning that covers GoodSync if you're interested, if you think it might be a good solution for you. You can see on the screen here, timgrey.me/greybackup will take you to their website so you can check it out for yourself and see if it's a good solution for you. Using an online backup as a supplement, not a bad idea at all. And so in terms of backing up, the key really is to be consistent, to have a good workflow for backing up your photos, and to make sure that ideally it's offsite as well. So multiple copies of your important data on multiple devices, ideally stored in multiple locations. It's all about keeping that information safe. We're trying to create a workflow where we can actually find our photos, but we also want to be able to actually use our photos, that we want them to actually exist, which means making sure that we're backing up all of that data, all the metadata, all of the photos, etc. And then part of that workflow in terms of actually, the key point ultimately is to be able to find your photos, right? So part of that workflow needs to be identifying favorites. And this could mean a variety of different things to different people. I mentioned that in the context of Lightroom, for example, the pick versus reject flag is a Lightroom specific feature. It's not a standard metadata field. It won't be saved out to the file if you save your metadata out to the actual images. To me, that's a problem. That means, number one, that I don't have independence from Lightroom. I need Lightroom in order to be able to access information about my photos, whereas star ratings are a part of standard metadata so that I could use virtually any software to view those star ratings. And so that means for me that I'd rather use star ratings. It also means that I need to think about my approach to star ratings. And so, depending on the software you're using, there might be different options for identifying your favorite photos. I would suggest that star ratings are probably the best approach because they're ubiquitous, because it's part of a metadata standard, because we're able to use that star rating in any software virtually. And so to me, that makes sense. But now I need to think about how I'm using star ratings. And for myself personally, I don't feel that a 1-star rating is worth assigning if it means it's a bad photo. And so I'd rather use a 1-star rating to say this is a keeper. I like this one. And then I'll use, increasing numbers of stars for increasingly great photos, hoping that one day I might have a 5-star rated photo. And so I'm using those star ratings in you might say, a little bit of a unique way. And I think that works perfectly great. It works for me, and that's what really matters the most in terms of my own workflow. So for other photographers, you might take a different approach. You might even not need star ratings at all. I know of photographers who don't need star ratings, they don't need pick flags, they don't need color labels, they don't need any metadata to identify their favorite photos, essentially, because the favorite photos are the ones that did not get deleted. So if you're very comfortable deleting your outtakes, you might cull down to a relatively low number of photos, a small number of photos, so that it's easy to find your images. That's not an approach that works for me. I'm paranoid about deleting. I'm backing up all the time. I don't want to delete any of my photos. In theory, I should, but I'm just not comfortable with that notion. I always feel like at some point I'm going to regret having deleted some photo in my collection. So different solutions, not only in terms of what works for you, but what you're comfortable with in your overall workflow. But again, point being is that for many photographers, one of the easiest ways to find an image you're looking for is to just browse your favorites. And that would very often be favorites in a particular folder, for example. And so, you saw the folders previously, Austria. And actually, I see there's a question here. Why do you use Austria twice in the folder name? I assume that was in reference to, actually, let's go ahead and take a walk backward and go take a look at that slide. Austria twice. I was just making sure that I didn't have an actual typo or something there. So Austria twice. Austria is there obviously multiple times by virtue of there being multiple trips to Austria. I believe what they're referring to is up at the top of the list of Austria folders, there's a standalone Austria folder. That's a parent folder. I started making so many trips to Austria that I decided it would be helpful if I would have a parent folder that I could collapse. So all of my Austria trip folders are inside a parent Austria folder so that I can tighten up my folder list as needed, just to help make it easier to navigate among those folders. In any event, using folder structure plus a star rating, for example, would make it relatively easy to locate images. I'm looking for a photo of the view through the keyhole of the Basilica shot in Rome. So I'll go to one of my Italy folders and filter by star rating and hopefully be able to find it. And very often I can. And so identifying those favorites, whether it's deleting the outtakes to streamline in terms of the total number of photos you're managing, or using some form of metadata to identify which images are your favorites from a given photo shoot, from a given trip, or whatever the case might be, that can be a tremendous help. And be thoughtful. Again, I mentioned that I use star ratings in a somewhat unique way. Be thoughtful about how you're actually putting those star ratings, for example, to use. Don't just assume that 1 star equals a bad image, 5 stars equals an amazing image, but think about what might make more sense in your own workflow for how you're using some of that metadata. And speaking of metadata, assigning keywords and other metadata. And I think metadata in general, relatively straightforward. For many photographers, for example, it's probably not all that important to identify, to put a title, for example, or a caption. Some of the metadata fields, if you go look at the very, very long list of fields that are available for metadata, you'll find that many of them probably don't relate to you. One of them that I always chuckle at is intellectual genre. I need to Google this at some point because I don't know what is meant by intellectual genre in the context of a photo. Whereas I do know what, title and caption mean, but I don't generally need titles and captions for my photos, for example. I don't find that I necessarily would make use of that information. Not that it couldn't be valuable. If you submit images to stock agencies, you may be, or very likely will be, required to fill in those fields. So other metadata you'd certainly want to look at and see is there some value to adding that. But for the most part, when I'm talking about metadata in the context of helping you organize your photos, it really means adding keywords. And keywords, keep in mind, serve two basic purposes. Number one, keywords, I think probably this is the primary purpose of keywords. Keywords enable you to locate photos. So if somebody said, "Hey Tim, do you have any pictures of sunbathers in the Mediterranean?" Why, yes, I had a photo of the coast of Capri in Italy, and there was a sunbather in there soaking up some sunshine. So I could search Mediterranean sunbather, and I would find this image. And so the keywords are primarily, I think, thought of as a way to find images. In addition, though, the keywords are helpful for reminding you about that content. And so, if this image was discovered out of context and somebody said, "Hey, where was this?" Now, of course, in my case, I could just look at the folder name. Maybe I could look at the file name, but I can also go to metadata and see what that location was. And so, one of the questions I often ask is, how much time should you spend keywording? Or more to the point, how much time do you want to spend keywording your images? And I think it would be fair to say that for the vast majority of photographers, given the choice, they would spend 0 time keywording their images. Then the question is, how much time, when you're looking for a photo and you can't find it, how much time do you wish you had spent keywording? And of course, the right answer in terms of what you should spend would be somewhere in between. Ideally, at least adding some basic keywords to your favorite images, at least identifying things that you might forget. So if it's a photo of the Eiffel Tower, you're not likely going to forget that that's the Eiffel Tower. In this particular case, I'm not likely to forget that this was captured on the island of Capri in Italy. But I might forget, which vantage point this was photographed from, or, some other details about the image. And so the keywords can help you to remember some of those details as well. So as much as probably none of us really want to spend too much time keywording, I would say that there is some value to that, at least to identify key subjects in your main photos and to try to think about your favorite photos. Try to think about what sort of information you might be potentially looking for later. Bearing in mind, by the way, if you've taken a look at any demos of the new Lightroom CC, I demonstrated this actually in a previous webinar in the GreyLearning Webinar Series, the search facility inside of the new Lightroom CC is rather impressive. You're essentially keywording based on image analysis. And so you could type, water, and this image would certainly show up. And you could type rocks, and this image probably would show up. And it's not based on you having added keywords. It's based on Adobe's software on their servers, because with Lightroom CC, remember, all of your images get uploaded to the cloud. The software is analyzing all of those images and performing that recognition automatically. It's, I have to say, pretty impressive. It does require that you're connected to the internet in order to search within Lightroom CC to take advantage of that capability, not to filter in other ways, but to take advantage of that search facility. It is quite impressive, though. In any event, hopefully that'll come to Lightroom Classic at some point, maybe Adobe. But point being that might eliminate the need for some of your keywording, but it doesn't eliminate all of the need. And I would still say there's some value in assigning keywords and to being thoughtful about how you approach keywording and, the degree to which, how many keywords do you really need? Am I ever going to be searching for pictures of rocks, for example? Probably not. So maybe rocks and rocky are not necessary in terms of keywords, but it depends on your own needs, how you use your images, etc. And I would also say, try not to fear change. I know I've got some questions here, and I'll try to get to as many of those as I can here in just a moment. But questions about, is it easy to merge catalogs? Can I split into 2 catalogs? Can I change folder names after? Can I change my workflow, essentially, is what a lot of that boils down to. And I would say absolutely. There was a time long ago I don't know why. I don't know whatever gave me this idea, but actually I do know. In the old days, when I was a wee little lad, we would take pictures on film. And most of that in my, what I would call my real photography, most of that was on slide film. And so those slides would go into pages of 20 slides each. And so to mark favorites, I would use a grease pencil and mark on the slide page, on the plastic essentially, I would mark the slides. So I would know which images were my favorites based on those grease pencil marks. And so based on that, somehow it seemed to make sense to me that I would identify favorite photos using color labels. But eventually I realized that that was kind of silly, that the star ratings gave me, better utility, and so I switched to the use of star ratings. Well, a red label back in the day meant this is a keeper. Well, I could very easily go and filter my images based on a red color label, select all of them, and then assign a star rating instead. And so it really would be very easy to make that transition. And especially if you're using software such as Lightroom that's got that catalog, it makes it easy to search and filter across your entire catalog of images. And so if, for example, you had been using Adobe Bridge and you had been using color labels in your workflow, then you switched to Lightroom. Lightroom and Adobe Bridge have different definitions of color labels, and so the color labels from Adobe Bridge by default would show up without a color. They would just be white, meaning there's a color label here, but I don't understand which color it is. But you can very easily, and this is a topic that's covered in that Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course that I mentioned, you can very easily then go and filter images based on the quote-unquote wrong definition of the color label, and then assign the correct color label. So for example, Adobe Bridge uses the word select in metadata to indicate a red color label, whereas Lightroom uses the word red to identify a red color label. But we can filter in Lightroom based on the select color label, as it were, and then select all of those images and assign a red color label. The point is that I know a lot of photographers, they get stuck in their ways. They realize that probably they should do things differently, but they don't want to make that change for fear of changing wrong or the hassles that might be involved. If you're thoughtful about, number one, redefining your workflow, and then figuring out what do I need to go back and change for my existing images to make sure that everything essentially matches up. So for example, I used to use color labels, now I'm using star ratings, so I want to go back and assign star ratings to all of those images that had color labels assigned to them. And then maybe use color labels for some other purpose other than identifying favorites. Put simply, kind of to summarize all of this, all of what I've been trying to convey here, I hope it's been helpful for all of you, but clearly define an organizational strategy that is as simple as possible, but not simpler, meaning that you want it to be simple and streamlined, but you want it to actually be useful, and that you can consistently follow. So making sure that, if you decide, I'm going to go through the dictionary and look at every single word in the dictionary and decide whether or not it applies to this image and then move on to the next image. Yeah, you can't do that consistently. No matter how fast you can read and how fast you can type, that's just not realistic. So make sure that you've got a workflow that's going to work for you, that's streamlined and as simple as it possibly can be, and that you that consistency is perhaps the most important thing. If sometimes you use star ratings to identify favorites, sometimes pick flags, sometimes you're using color labels, now when you need to go find favorites, it's a very difficult task, to be sure. All right, so we've got some questions here. Let me try to get to as many of these questions as I possibly can, given the time available. So thank you from the Central Coast of California, who misses my visits there teaching. Thank you very much. And Bob, also, I miss coming out there and seeing you out there every year. Let's see here. So Lightroom Classic, great question. So have I switched to Lightroom CC? I mentioned and I showed screenshots from Lightroom Classic. Have I switched to Lightroom CC? And if not, why? No, I have not. And I will not for the near term at least. And part of that is just that Lightroom CC, the new software, is lacking some features that I need. For example, you cannot print your photos out of Lightroom CC. That would be an inconvenience. Lightroom CC is a very new piece of software. It does not have all the features that Lightroom Classic has. Lightroom Classic has been around for 10 years, give or take. And so I would say that, for now, Lightroom CC is missing features that I need. I'm also not crazy about this notion of having all of my photos synchronized to the cloud, in part because I'm not always connected to the internet. I don't always have a fast internet connection, and frankly, I don't need all of my photos to be available from every device that I might possibly use. I'd rather be selective about that synchronization to the cloud. So Lightroom CC, it certainly can work for some photographers. I would say for most photographers who follow any of my work, I think it's fair to say, are most likely better off with Lightroom Classic, meaning that your needs are probably somewhat similar to mine, and so Lightroom Classic is still going to be a better fit than Lightroom CC, but it does depend upon the photographer, to be sure. All right, will Lightroom Classic eventually go away? Well, that's a tricky question because, part of me would say, well, of course, any piece of software that exists today will eventually go away. But that's not really what the question is about, is it? So the question really is, do I think there's any immediate plans that Lightroom Classic will be discontinued? The name certainly is not very encouraging. Classic makes it sound like it's being put out to pasture. Adobe has very consistently, including in sort of meetings where they're demonstrating what they're planning with some of their software, they've made it abundantly clear that their intent is to stand behind Lightroom Classic and continue updating it. So I don't have any concerns in the short term about Lightroom Classic maintaining its availability. When you're updating Lightroom with Adobe, is it obvious to select Lightroom Classic? So the subscription, it's not exactly clear, and I know there's been some talk among folks at Adobe recognizing that when you go to the Adobe website, it's easy to find Lightroom CC. It's not so easy to find Lightroom Classic. So there is a little bit of a lack of clarity there in terms of what you're subscribing to. But also, when you are looking at the Creative Cloud application, when you're updating to a new version, bear in mind that Lightroom Classic now will show as Lightroom Classic. Lightroom CC will show up as Lightroom CC, but of course Lightroom Classic used to be called Lightroom CC, so there is the potential for confusion there as well. All right, let's see. A few more questions here. Have a problem. Can I reinstall the software without losing the catalog? Yes, absolutely. So if you have a problem where you need to reinstall, if you need to uninstall and reinstall Lightroom, the catalog will stay behind. So as long as you don't delete the catalog or the folder that contains the catalog, you'll be in good shape. You can always uninstall Lightroom and reinstall Lightroom. So that is no problem whatsoever. It will leave all those settings behind. Just obviously make sure that you know where your catalog is and that you know when you reinstall Lightroom, it will recreate a clean catalog. Make sure that you actually go about the process then of opening up that your real catalog, so to speak. But yes, absolutely will be retained. Let's see here. Split the catalog and photos onto 2 drives. So if your hard drive is getting full, for example, what would be the process? Just to keep it relatively short, inside of Lightroom, what I would do, if you need to expand to a second hard drive, then you plug in the new hard drive. So you've got hard drive number 1 and hard drive number 2, and number 1 is full and number 2 is empty. When you plug in that hard drive number 2, Lightroom won't show it to you, essentially. That hard drive will not be visible inside of Lightroom because there are no photos being managed by Lightroom, but you can add a folder. You can create a folder on that new hard drive. So to the right of the folders heading in Lightroom, you can click the plus and choose to add a folder, not a subfolder, but a folder, and create that on the brand new hard drive. For example, create a folder called Photos, and that folder, including the hard drive then, will be visible inside of Lightroom. You could drag and drop to move photos from one drive to the other, for example. And obviously, you'd make sure you have a good backup before you actually went about doing that, but making it possible then to move from one to the other. You could certainly also export photos from Lightroom as a catalog. There's an export as catalog feature so that you can create a catalog as you export, so you could safely make sure that that's safely finished, that you've got a copy of those photos with a catalog that you could then open separately. Once that's finished, you could remove the photos from the first catalog. So there's ways that you can go about splitting if need be. All right. Do you ID favorites when actually download or later on? So I don't assign favorites during the download process, in part because I'm using Lightroom and there's not really a facility to identify individuals other than to not import photos that are not favorites, outtakes, for example. So I would say that I do that sorting, that identifying of favorites after the fact, but that, if you're using software that enables you to, for example, identify favorites from the start, then I certainly would consider that. For example, in the camera, many cameras support the ability to assign star ratings in the camera itself. I don't use this very often because I'm generally too busy taking pictures, but if I took a photo that I really think this is going to be a keeper, I want to make sure to review this later, I'll assign a star rating to that image in the camera. So again, trying to get that workflow, getting that process going as early in your overall process as possible. So Jeff asks, how many good sync copies of your catalog do you have? How do you use good sync? How do you good sync your catalog once on the external? So my catalog is actually on the internal hard drive, but I back it up to the external hard drive, the primary external hard drive that I use for photos. So I'm backing up my catalog to my photos drive, and of course I'm backing up my photos drive, and I always maintain at least 2 backups. So I've got my actual photos drive, and then I've got a backup of that, and then I have a second backup of that. And somewhere here in this long list of questions that are coming into, I know I won't get to all of them, but I'll get to as many as I can. One of the questions from, I think it was the Florida Keys, asked about whether or not I travel with a backup drive, and yes, I absolutely do the vast majority of the time. I always have a way of backing up photos while I'm traveling. The only reason I might not carry a good sync backup copy, as it were, of my hard drive is if I was going to use an internal hard drive for maybe a short trip or something. Then I would just have another backup drive. But if I'm taking a photos drive with me, then I always travel with a backup, and during the trip I will use Good Sync to back up from the photos drive to the photos backup drive. But before I leave on any trip, I'm also making sure to perform a backup that I'm leaving behind, so that if anything happens to my hard drives while I'm traveling, I still have a backup back at home. Good question here. I mentioned my paranoia and my unwillingness to delete photos and various other things. But once I've downloaded my digital images from my card to Lightroom, do you erase the card so it can be used again, or do you save all of your digital cards? I'm not quite that paranoid. I do reformat my cards, but not until I've downloaded them to my external hard drive and made a copy to another external hard drive, so that I've got at least those other 2 copies, and then I feel comfortable reformatting the card. I do know photographers who save all those cards. To me, that just becomes a physical storage challenge on some level, and keeping those organized can be a challenge. But at least saving them for a little while for trips that are especially important might not be a bad idea. Let's see here. How do you organize slides? That I mentioned this a little bit, or I got to this question and then passed over it because we're going to be talking about folders. But if you don't have date information available, and that can be tricky. If you're organizing photos that you don't necessarily know all of the information about, then it can be challenging to define. If I'm using a location-based folder structure and then I get a bunch of old photos that are prints, photographic prints from a long time ago, and I want to scan those in and organize them, I don't know where necessarily all those photos were captured. And so you might have to have a variation. In the context of old family photos, that is something where I would generally say that a date-based structure is probably best, and that I would then try to estimate dates. And it depends on how many photos we're talking about, but for example, I don't need a year, month, and day structure necessarily, because I don't necessarily have that granular, my information isn't necessarily that granular. And so instead I might do years, or even possibly decades, for example, might be adequate, depending on how many images we're talking about. But having some form of structure, recognizing, if we've all seen in old documentaries or documentaries from a long time ago, many of those photos are marked circa in the year, so approximately a given year. So you might file based on your best guess. with some indication in metadata, for example, that you don't know the actual date of those images. All right, let's see. How do you back up one catalog beyond the hard drive it's located on? So for backing up your Lightroom catalog, obviously, if your catalog is on your internal hard drive and you're using software to back up your internal hard drive, so for example, I'm using Time Machine on my laptop. If you're doing that, obviously you've got a backup right there. But regardless of that other approach, I always recommend backing up with Lightroom. Use Lightroom to create a backup copy of your catalog and back that up to an external hard drive. So for example, to the external hard drive you're using for your photos, if that's the case, partly because then you're going to make another backup of that photos drive. But the reason I recommend using Lightroom to create that backup in the first place is that Lightroom also offers the option to check the integrity and to optimize that catalog, sort of streamlining the file itself, you might say. And I definitely would want to take advantage of, especially that option to confirm the integrity of the catalog itself. And so I highly recommend using Lightroom as your primary method of backing up the Lightroom catalog, recognizing that you might have other methods of backing up as well. Any other metadata that is not stored outside of the catalog that can't be saved? The key things that are not backed up. So when you enable that option, I mentioned being able to save your metadata out to the image files using that setting in Lightroom. That is, I think, a valuable feature. What does it exclude? What's not included as part of that process? And you can think of that in general as anything that is a Lightroom-specific feature. And so naturally, as I already mentioned, pick and reject flags are not included. Collections, membership in collections is not. That's a Lightroom-only feature. That's in the catalog. You can't back that up other than by backing up your catalog. The history in the develop module. So the changes that you've applied in the develop module are written to the actual files if you've saved the metadata out to the images, but the history is not. If you make virtual copies, those are only contained in the Lightroom catalog. Let's see, did I miss something? I've probably missed one or two things possibly, but the key idea here is that if it's a feature that's specific to Lightroom as opposed to a metadata standard, then that would be something that is not backed up in that way. Again, you'd want to make sure then to back up the catalog. So a question about if you decide that you want to change your methodology, you want to change your approach to how you're structuring or naming your folders, how would you go about doing that? Well, if you're using Lightroom, absolutely do that inside of Lightroom. Just right-click and you can rename a folder. And obviously make sure that you have a plan beforehand to decide what your structure is going to be, and then simply go about renaming. And obviously it can take some time. If you, for example, decide that, on second thought, a date-based folder structure doesn't work for you and you'd rather use an approach similar to what I'm using in terms of sort of location-based or the way you think about your photos, I wouldn't feel that I need to go back and rename all of my photos in one sitting. Instead, I would go through and just, however much time I have to spend on that right now, I'll spend a little time doing that, renaming the existing folders that are that have names based on dates and change that into, whatever words I decide make sense, and just do a batch of them at a time so that it's not too overwhelming. But you can just do that right inside of Lightroom. And obviously, if you're using other software, same sort of thing. There's also a question about folders versus collections in the context of Lightroom. In the new Lightroom CC, collections are called albums. Same thing, different name. These sorts of features are available elsewhere. So in the Elements Organizer, for example, you have those albums available. And the difference is that albums or collections are essentially virtual, meaning a folder sort of actually exists out on your hard drive. You can go out into your operating system and you can see a folder. Again, sort of that's really virtual as well, but let's just treat that as a real thing, a folder on your hard drive. A collection in Lightroom, or an album in Lightroom CC, or an album in the Photoshop Elements Organizer is a grouping of photos that is not out on your hard drive. It is actually just inside of the software. And so a folder, you could go find it on your hard drive and look at the files in that folder on your hard drive using the operating system. A collection is a similar grouping of photos, but just inside of Lightroom. So in the context of Lightroom, folders relate to the actual folders and files out on your hard drive. collections or albums relate to just metadata, relate to grouping your images in a kind of virtual way. And so, for example, assigning a keyword is similar to adding an image to a collection. You could achieve the same basic functionality instead of, let's say you're working on a calendar for next year. Instead of creating a calendar 2019 collection, you could add calendar 2019 as a keyword, and then when you want to view those images, you just filter based on that keyword. And so they're just a way to actually enable you to organize your photos in another way. They look sort of like folders in the context of how you access them, how you make use of them, but they're different in the context of really just being a metadata element. So let's see, date for folders and then keywords. So yeah, Kurt says he's sort of the opposite of what I was referencing in terms of using folder structure based on how I think of my photos and recognizing I can always filter based on date. And so Kurt suggests that he's using a date-based folder structure, and then he's using keywords to help locate based on location information. Perfectly reasonable. And that's why, in part, I started with that notion of my workflow doesn't work for everyone. I just want to give you food for thought so that you can identify what makes the most sense, what aspects of your workflow might improve by being changed, or how to define your workflow in the first place. And so, by all means, if you've got a different approach, there's a whole lot of different ways that you can organize your photos, but a lot of it comes down, of course, to the core concepts involved. So there's a lot of basic concepts, metadata, star ratings, keywords, etc. And then it's just thinking about how you're actually going to implement those features. All right, let's see here. What else? We have a couple more questions maybe before we wrap up for the day. Let's see. Downloading when you have multiple locations on one card. So if you run into a situation frequently where a single card that you're downloading photos from, those images really belong in more than one location, meaning let's say, for example, you went on a trip and you visited 2 countries and you want to separate the photos, and one card contains images from both countries. You want to put the photos into the folder based on the country. What I would tend to do in that case is still use your normal workflow for downloading, but download into a folder called something along the lines of like photos to sort. And I'd even put an underscore at the beginning of that so it goes to the top of the list in terms of the folder structure. And that way you can then separate out later. In theory, you could name the folder based on the first country you visited, for example, and then move the other images into another folder. The problem with that is you might forget to move those images. And so I'd rather have the images clearly identified as being images that need further sorting, but I still want to get them into Lightroom right away, get them into my normal workflow. I would just use that sort of, you might say, temporary folder for an interim step. I mentioned that XMP sidecar files, and so Jeff asks how much additional hard drive space those files take. Very, very little. A capture might be, a raw capture, maybe 25 megabytes, depending on the resolution of your camera. And most of my XMP sidecar files are on the order of about 15 kilobytes, KB. So very, very small files, not going to make a big, significant impact in terms of the space, your storage consumption. Audrey asks, confirms, I suppose, but that I do not convert to DNG, the Adobe Digital Negative format. And I would say that yes, that no, I don't convert to DNG, but yes, it is a solution that many photographers that they incorporate into their workflow. The core reason that I do not convert my photos to DNG is that I'm not comfortable deleting my original raw captures. I probably should be. There are some advantages to DNG, but there are some potential disadvantages. For example, I mentioned that when you save metadata out to the image files, the metadata actually gets saved into the Adobe DNG file, not to a sidecar file. That can create a little bit of a challenge in terms of backing up. None of this is really major significant issue. Really what this boils down to for me personally is that I just don't like the idea of deleting my original raw capture, converting from my raw captures into a DNG file and then deleting the raw. I should be comfortable with that, but I'm not really. And so I prefer to keep my originals. And I don't see that as being any significant negative impact on my workflow either. The Adobe DNG file, by the way, generally speaking, because of the lossless compression, you're not losing any image quality, you're not losing anything, and yet the file size will be smaller. So about 20% on average, depending on what kind of original you're working with. So I don't have anything against DNG really, but I just don't find that it's, the right solution for my workflow, in large part because the advantages don't outweigh the disadvantages to me, and that primary disadvantage, honestly, is really just about me not wanting to delete the originals. So how many hard drives do you use to store all of your roughly 400,000 photos, and do they all travel with you? So part of the reason that I started traveling with all of my photos is because it was possible. So I could have all of my photos on a single hard drive that could practically fit in a shirt pocket. The problem is I prefer to use rugged drives, and I use bus-powered hard drives, meaning they don't need a power adapter. I just plug it into a USB port, and that provides the power and the data transfer, and I can't get a big enough hard drive. So I'm currently using two hard drives, two 4 terabyte hard drives to store all of my photos. I don't want to do that. I'd rather have them all on one drive, but I don't have a single drive that gives me the capacity that I need. I'm hoping that that becomes available soon. But yeah, so I don't travel with everything most of the time, because the approach I've taken is I've archived off to a second hard drive, still inside my Lightroom catalog, my same Lightroom catalog, but I've archived off to a second hard drive the photos that I think I'm least likely to use. As a very general rule, that means mostly older photos. The older they are, the less likely they are to be favorites, at least for me personally. And also, they tend to be for folders that contain mostly just kind of personal photos from if I went on a trip that wasn't really a photography trip. So I've archived off the photos that I'm least likely to need access to during a trip, and so I tend not to travel with those. That said, the reason I don't really necessarily recommend traveling with your entire collection of photos, you're putting them at some degree of risk. I mean, I suppose you could also argue that now that becomes an offsite backup so that if something happens to your house, you've still got, a copy of your photos with you. But my point being that it's not so much that I recommend that as a workflow approach for most photographers. It's that because my work often requires me, I'm often on extended trips for weeks or months at a time, and I often need to access those photos so that I can, still publish content or publish articles or, whatever the case might be. And so I would say that for me, there's an additional need. It's sort of, I don't really have a particular desire to travel with a laptop, except I really need the utility of the laptop, not just for downloading my photos, but because I have to do all sorts of other work along the way, and a laptop just makes more sense for me for that purpose. So I'm traveling with my photos in large part because I need to access the photos, not because I really want to have them with me for any other particular purpose. So one more question, and then we'll break for today. And by the way, there's still questions I've not gotten to. If you're already signed up for the Ask Tim Grey email newsletter, stay tuned. I'll try to address as many of these as questions in upcoming Ask Tim Grey emails. Or if you've got a really pressing question, feel free to email those to me, and I'll try to address as many of those as I possibly can. But a final question: at home, do you keep your backup in the freezer and a second in a media safe? I don't know if that question about the freezer was meant to be taken literally, or if maybe there's a translation issue. But no, I wouldn't keep a hard drive in a freezer, because that cold wouldn't be very good for it. I would say, actually, that's a good question in terms of the operating limits of the hard drive, but I have to assume that inside of a freezer would be too cold, would be beyond the operating limits of the drive with no benefit. But if there's a hardware engineer out there that knows better, please send me an email about that. In any event, what I do is, in theory, keep an external hard drive copy at a separate physical location. And so, for example, at a storage unit, if you've got a storage facility, or if you've got a studio versus home, if you've got two locations, the office versus home, whatever the case might be, if you can have your photos in a separate physical location as well as on multiple hard drives, that is the ideal. I don't go so far as to use like a fireproof safe or anything like that. Certainly, that's probably a good idea. Probably I should do something like that. but I don't. I often refer to myself as being paranoid when it comes to backing stuff up, but I don't go so far as to having a fireproof safe for my hard drives. So I guess even my paranoia has its limits. Actually, one last question, because this is an issue that has come up a bit. Susan asks about Lightroom 5. Still using Lightroom 5? Does she need to upgrade to Lightroom Classic? And I would say not yet, but probably at some point. So this is an issue worth addressing, I think. I did write a blog post about this. It was in the GreyLearning Focal Point email newsletter. If you're not getting that, be sure to check that out. But in terms of the life of Lightroom, so there was a question about, will Lightroom Classic be discontinued? And Adobe has made it clear they intend to continue supporting Lightroom Classic. But what about Lightroom 5 or Lightroom 6 for that matter? Those older versions, the versions of Lightroom that were available as a standalone license, are no longer being updated. So now you can only get Lightroom as a subscription. So with the Creative Cloud subscription, for example, the photography plan. So if you need support for new raw capture formats, you're going to need to subscribe. If you need any of the new features for whatever reason, if the older version of the software at some point no longer works with an updated operating system, there are potential issues along those lines, but Lightroom as a standalone non-subscription product has essentially been discontinued. So in December, there was Lightroom, Bella 6.14 was that last version of Lightroom. That is it. Any future updates will require that you be a subscriber, that you've signed up for a subscription plan using the Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. So you don't need to change. It's not that that software will stop working altogether. It's not that it has a time limit in terms of being able to actually use it. But at some point, there may be issues that require you to have a new version, as it were. And when that happens, then your only option will be a subscription. I mean, I suppose for a period of time here, you'll be able to find those standalone licenses available for purchase out there somewhere. I imagine that will go away very quickly, though, but it will not be updated. So new raw formats, etc. So. All right. Well, we've gone over time a little bit, but it's been a lot of fun. I hope that you've all got some valuable tips out of this, that you found the presentation helpful. And I will, as I mentioned, try to follow up on as many of these questions as possible in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. In the meantime, thanks very much. We will be having an additional presentation or two later this month in January. So stay tuned for some upcoming presentations as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. And once again, a big thank you to Tamron for sponsoring the webinar series and making all of this possible. And thanks to you for attending, for watching the presentation, for submitting some great questions. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.